We looked at two countries, Austria and the Netherlands, which have rather similar policies. We interviewed over 150 sex workers, most of them migrants. And we didn't do that ourselves, but we trained sex workers and ex-sex workers to do the interviews for us. And that, of course, has a huge advantage because of issues of trust and understanding. We also interviewed scores and scores of administrators and politicians, particularly administrators at the local level. We went through piles of documents and we put it all together in our analysis. So what did we find? We found, for example, that in the Netherlands, despite the fact that we repealed the ban on brothels in 2000, we see a gradual drift towards a much more repressive prostitution policy. And we call that regulatory drift. It's the sum of all sorts of small measures taken at the local level, often outside of the political view, that all point in the same direction: more control, more repression. So, for example, in the Netherlands we have so-called enforcement arrangements. So these are rules designed by administrators to inspect brothels, to fine brothels, and often more or less outside of the judicial system. Another such thing is what we are very critical of in our book are the infamous signals of trafficking. So police officers or other people go into brothels to monitor them, and they're on the lookout for so-called signals of trafficking with the sex workers. Now, what is a signal of trafficking? Well, let's say you find a woman who doesn't speak the language, who doesn't know where she lives in the Netherlands, who is crying. You begin to suspect that she might be a victim of trafficking, right? But it goes much further. So having a lapdog. Many sex workers have lapdogs, or some sex workers have lapdogs. No, that's a signal of trafficking because the pimp has given her a lapdog because she's otherwise lonely. Being dropped off by somebody in a car. The more expensive the car, the more certain you are that she's a victim of trafficking. So what some cities did, like the city of The Hague, they then create a file and they give a notice to the brothel owner and say, well, we suspect that one of your people working for you or in your brothel is a victim of trafficking. She will lose her job. She will lose her employment site. She can't work in the rest of the city anymore because every other brothel owner will not hire her because he's afraid that he will hire a victim of trafficking and will get fined. So the sex worker has to move to another city. What if the sex worker disagrees with this? Tough luck, because you can't appeal it. The only thing you can do is agree to it, and then you can get services. But many sex workers say, I'm not a victim of trafficking. In fact, this is what our interviews show, those 150 interviews. The overriding story is a story of migration. So young women, let's say from the heartlands of Bulgaria or Romania, often with a bit of education, because it's often the more enterprising people who take those decisions, they decide to go to a large city like Vienna and work as a sex worker. Why? Well, they already have a friend who works there as a sex worker who says, you should come work here, it's good money. It's not, we also looked at earnings. Don't believe the movies that show you that sex workers make tens of thousands of euros a month or something. That's extremely exceptional. The average income that we found for a sex worker in Vienna, for example, was somewhere between 1,300 and 2,000 euros a month, which is a lot of money if you come from Romania, but it's not, not a huge income. But they earn enough and save enough to send money back home. So the overwhelming story is a story of migration. And many sex workers tell us that it's much better than the other job options that are open to them, like working in the cleaning industry, or if you can get it, working in a supermarket, stacking shelves. The money is better, the work conditions are better, and actually many of them say they enjoy meeting the men, because don't forget that gender relations in Vienna are very different from that in the heartlands of Romania or Bulgaria. So I'm not saying and I understand that people find this I was somewhat taken aback by this story, but it is a story that we find over and over and over again. And is there no trafficking? Is there no exploitation? Absolutely. We found in about 10% of our cases that women said that they were exploited. And in very rare cases it was accompanied by violence, but most of the time it was financial. So people, handlers who took their money and kept them in a state of dependence for a while. But in all those cases you saw that the sex worker managed to get out of those situations by herself, with the help of friends, with the help of clients sometimes, or go to the police. Many went to the police and the police helped them. It's certainly in Austria that was the case.
Here people say, well, most trafficking isn't reported because...
Yeah, that's a very common argument. There's a dark number, right? But again, we go back to the problem with numbers. Nobody has ever shown that that dark number exists. So if trafficking is such a widespread phenomenon, you would have found dozens, right? If what some politicians and some police officers in Amsterdam and the Netherlands have said, if 50 to 90% of women behind the windows are forced, it's a huge bandwidth, right? But if that were true, you would find dozens. So I think we have to get used to the idea it's not trafficking that's the problem. The big problem is exploitation, labor exploitation in the country of arrival. But I will get there later. So let me get back to our findings. We found regulatory drift, and it's the slow accumulation of small measures at the administrative level that bent the policy gradually into a much more repressive direction. And in fact, what often it is accompanied by what we call goal displacement. So the original goals of the repeal of the ban on brothels have been abandoned and replaced by very repressive goals, repressing prostitution, making the whole prostitution areas in our towns smaller and smaller. In Austria, we found another phenomenon which is, I think, equally interesting. So the city of Vienna, at some point in 2011, issued a new prostitution policy. And it had very progressive elements. It ended up in a near disaster. And why? Because of what we call agency capture. So the policy was immediately hijacked by the police. The police in Vienna is the traditional agency that implements prostitution policy, and all the police did was focus on street prostitution. Driven by media. The media were themselves driven by right-wing political parties and Christian democratic parties, driven by angry citizen organizations who got a lot of space in the press. In fact, it turned out there were also citizen organizations that didn't mind prostitution. They were quite vocal about it, but they were never getting into the press. And they were chasing the outdoor sex workers in Vienna. In those days, we're talking here around 2011, there were many more clubs in Vienna, brothels, than there were outdoor sex workers. Nevertheless, the clubs didn't get much attention, although at the moment there is a budding licensing system beginning to take shape. But all the attention went to chasing the outdoor sex workers. And we describe in some detail what that led to. It was talking about the erosion of civic rights, which I talked about earlier. Women were arrested arbitrarily. They were fined arbitrarily. They walked from home to the designated area, and then they were arrested or fined because they were soliciting outside the designated area, except they were just walking to their workplace. Militia, private militia organized by residents, started to beat up sex workers. And they were chased further and further away to very dangerous, deserted areas of the city. There's a whole story there, you can read it in our book. But agency capture led to a huge discrepancy between the policy on paper and the policy on the ground. So two effects, regulatory drift and agency capture. But we also found something on the more national level, where policy is formulated, where politicians form coalitions and design and formulate public policy. And what we found in both countries is the power of discourse. So why is it, we wondered, that all these administrators do the same thing, namely bend the policy towards a repressive end? Why weren't there administrators who said, no, we can't do that. We have a law, right? And we have repealed the brothel ban. That's a quite progressive law. We should stick to those goals. No. And we worked with them. Huh? So we spoke to them every 3 months. That was part of our research. And they all started to move away from those progressive goals. It's the power of discourse. So in the Netherlands, starting almost immediately after the repeal of the ban on brothels, you saw that a particular discourse about prostitution began to take shape. We saw a coalition forming of Christian parties, radical feminists, social democrats in parliament, who began to promulgate this discourse of prostitution as trafficking and sex workers as victims. And then there was something that in the Netherlands which really was a shock to the system, you could say. That was the Snape affair, where 2 Turkish brothers exploited about 75 women. There was suspicion they had more, but for 75 they could prove it, around 75, in the regulated sector, in the licensed sector. So then many politicians and administrators said, well, if this can happen in the licensed sector, we're doing something wrong. But I think that was, of course, a terrible situation, but the conclusions that were drawn from them were wrong. But again, it moved the discourse further and further into the abolitionist, repressive camp. So the power of discourse is enormously important, and it is a cement, as it were, that holds all the disparate elements of policy making together. And then finally, what we find on the level of national policy making is that the regulation of prostitution is affected by designated prostitution law. Most countries have one or more, but even more by ancillary law, like immigration law or labor law or tax law, or even in the Netherlands the laws on data storage and data use. So I already said immigration law usually not only restricts the entry of migrants or certain types of migrants, every country distinguishes between desirable and undesirable migrants, but also once they're in the country, it restricts the type of work they can accept. And very often migrants, new migrants, particularly those with little education, find themselves trapped in dead-end jobs where there are, or all sorts of restrictions, where they are vulnerable to exploitation. Labor laws often also push sex workers into a dependency situation with brothel owners, making them again very, very vulnerable to exploitation. And so we have lots and lots of examples, and again it's very hard to track down. You need to go into the nitty-gritty detail of the laws and their effects on the target groups, but we find that all those ancillary laws taken together often have a bigger impact on the life and work situation of sex workers than designated prostitution law.